No introduction needed. Enjoy.
Right, enjoy versioning. Okay. There's nothing controversial here. Okay, so all you know that we have multiple releases of Fire. We've had 5 major releases. We're starting to work on 6 now. Very little has happened. We're just dealing with 5 for the moment. So over time, we break things in the specification. In some fantasy world, we get it right first time. But I don't believe that that's ever happened on any individual element first time. Because the right thing for Fire is a compromise between a bunch of different tensions and perspectives around simplicity and complexity and thoroughness and only doing what everybody agrees to. And the only way that I've seen in all the time running Fire, the community, the only way I've seen for us to find that optimal point is by repeated trying and seeing how it goes and practice. So we don't get it right first time. And it's better for us to actually fix things. And it's very definitely a maturity process where things gradually settle and get stable. Sometimes they're just too hard to change, even if they're wrong. And so eventually we get to a point of stability. And the maturity rating is key to understanding that process. And so all of our artifacts have a maturity rating which reflects where they are in the community. And then eventually we mark them and say, okay, we're done. It's not that it couldn't be possible that would have made mistakes. It's just now it's too hard to change them. And we just have to live with what we've got. And we call that normative. And the intention of normative is that if you have an implementation, you don't have to change it as we go forward through the versions. Life is just not so simple as that, but that's the principle. And so in the meantime, all of us support multiple versions as we move more and more of the core to normative. And hopefully in release 6, we'll see quite a lot of the core go normative, and we're actually changing our processes so that we can do that, because we need to respond to how things are playing out, which is a little bit different than how we expected. So here, release 1 is not functionally supported in any ecosystem or tool that I know of. And then we released 2 in October 2015. And you can see the other dates for the releases. Release 2 is still used in the USA. I don't know if it's used anywhere else, although someone surely will come up after this and tell me. It's being phased out and replaced by release 4 in USA. It's fully supported by all of the HL7 tools, and we haven't started talking about an end of life for our tooling support for it at this point. It has been mentioned, but we haven't talked about it. There's another release that some of the tools support called release 2B, which was adopted by some commercial projects, but they're phasing out and moving to 4 at the moment. And release 3, which is not used much now, there's still some use in Europe. It's still fully supported by all the tooling. We're not going to be talking about end of life for that until a few years after we end of life support for R2, and I don't know when we'll do that. Then we have release 4, which is the main focus of implementation around the world. We did a release 4B, which was supposed to be a small patch that came out quickly after release 4, just fix a few specific areas of release 4. You can see how quickly we got it out. And adoption hasn't been spectacular. And it kind of is actually more a process staging into release 5. I will talk about release 5 tomorrow in detail, so I won't go into the subject right now. We're supporting all those versions from 2 to 5. All of our specifications come with a release history, a web page, which is driven by a JSON file, which describes the published history of the specification. You can, and lots of tools do, use those JSON files to find the versions and the releases and to navigate through the publications. And there's actually another package file, which I just put on hl7.org/fire, and we'll move to all of the published implementations, which lists all the packages on the website. So that's all tooling available. So what we know is that versioning is expensive. And sometimes that means it's profitable for some, although it's not really good profitability, and it's bad for health. We've seen that with version 2 versioning. And the other thing that I've seen is that we have much argument about everything to do with versions. I got me to turn the mute speaker. Okay, great. I can do that. Oh no, what have you done? Which screen is being shared now? PowerPoint's done a stupid thing. All right, we'll stick with this. Okay, so we know that versioning is expensive. And that we all want to argue about it. And so I'm sure that when we get to question time, you're going to want to argue with me about something that I've said. Feel free, but do be polite. So first question is, what version is the version of this resource that I'm dealing with? I'm dealing with some fragment of XML or JSON. What version is it? I made a very deliberate decision. You can blame me for this one. Back in the very beginning, that the version would not be stated in the fragment, the JSON or the XML fragment. And I did that because once you get to stability, the fragment conforms to multiple versions. It's not a single version. It's a set of data that conforms to some expectations that you have of it, and it is not your expectations. So the version is a property of the channel or the context in which you're handling the data, not the data itself. And resources might conform, be correct for multiple versions. So it is explicit in the capability statement. So every server puts up a capability statement. You consult the capability statement to find out what version the data is. But in any exchange, the version actually applies to the exchange protocol, not the data itself. And interestingly, the capability statement does not necessarily itself be in the same version as the version it's stating that it's describing. That's a bit of a head bender, but if you imagine a single repository full of a whole bunch of capability statements for servers out there on the web, where the servers are running different versions of Fire, but all the capability statements in the repository are the one version of Fire. So they're actually describing different versions. But if you want to know what version a server is doing, you ask its capability statement. If you're not doing REST, then there's other contexts. It's also explicit in a profile. A profile says what version of Fire it's profiling. So a profile on observation resource is actually a profile on observation resource release 4, not on any version. So that is version specific. And implementation guides also specifically state the version that they are. Some of you will note that implementation guide could state multiple versions. I didn't fail to vote against that in committee, but I should have. I have no idea how that will ever be implemented, and I write the publisher, so I don't know how that'll ever happen. But resources can conform to many profiles. So a profile, and this is subject of much confusion. No, I'll get back to that. There's much confusion. The resource, when you describe a profile is a set of rules on a resource. And you can have like a set of rules about how the resource is authored, a set of rules about the clinical content of the resource, a set of rules about the attribution on the resource. It can conform to those independently of each other, or you could have a set of rules about laboratory observations, a set of rules about sodium, plasma sodium observations, and it can conform to all of those rules. So a resource never is the profile it conforms to. It's the wrong wording to use in your head or in your spoken language. A resource conforms to a profile and can conform to many profiles, even if it doesn't state that it does. And you can just, does it conform to a profile? And just because it claims that it conforms to a profile doesn't mean that it does actually do that. You always have to test that, and you can. Oh, what happened there? Who knows what happened there? What has it done? Okay, all right. But you can, if you really, really want to, you can state the version inside a resource by saying that the resource conforms to the structure definition for patient and release 4. So you can do that. And occasionally I see a resource that has done that, and the validator will check that if you make that claim. You can see this one claims to also conform to R5 of US core, as well as to being an R4 patient. You can just stack up the claims, and then we can test whether they're true or not. And you can see that you do the versioning slightly differently. The base spec is a special case. I won't explore the reasons for that. So you can make that claim in a resource. You could actually claim, following my logic, you can also have a claim that is conformant to release 5 patient, which it would be. So it can be release 4 and 5 at the same time. So if you're thinking that that will tell you which version to parse by, it won't, because you need to parse in the version you want it to be, because you're going to use it. What's the point of parsing in the version it thinks it makes some claim about and go, well, I parsed it in that version, but I can't use it. You need to parse it for your use of it. All right. Now, in the version number strategy, so now talk about the versioning of fire releases themselves. Our policy is that we follow SEMVer generally. So we use publication.minor.patch. So publication is our major version. So release 5 will be 5. Earlier on, we hadn't synced and our policy was different. So before release 3, with the 3.02 would be patch on release 3, but the intermediary versions would be like 3.1 because we were starting to work on 4 and 3.2 and 3.3. And release 4B is 4.3 because we already used 4.1 and 4.2 for 5. But as of 5, we've gone to patches. So it's just 5.0.0 dash something. You can't sort those purely alphabetically because we have snapshots and ballots and they intersperse. But R6 is currently 6.0.0/-CI build. And CI build means it's a rolling version. It's going to be gone whenever someone makes a new commit. And the implementation guides follow the same pattern. But with regard to SEMVer, HL7 is not publishing software, it's publishing standards. So when it comes to the precise definition of minor and what changes are allowed within the scope of a minor, our definitions don't strictly align to SEMVer, which is software versioning. So we make some backwards breaking changes in some cases, but in principle, it's still a minor version. It's not the same as software versioning, but it's close. And some of you might want to argue with me, but that's what we do. All right. For profiles, for what we do, we use SEMVer. Again, we use the standards variant of SEMVer, but our policy is that we use SEMVer for all our profiles, terminologies, and so forth. And we encourage you who are publishing those things to do the same. Not all sources do the same. In particular, code systems are often versioned simply by date. Like Loink has 2.7, I think it's current, or 2.8 or whichever. But for instance, SNOMED, RxNorm, they're always done just by date of release. And that's legal. And you can see the list of things that we know about people doing with that link there. You can, now we encourage when you release a package, which most things are released by packages, we encourage that all the things in the package have the same version as the package itself. So everything has a consistent set of versions. It's easier for users. You don't have to, and we release, for instance, terminology.hl7.org does not do that. All the code systems are versioned independently, and that's because mostly they don't change. And so it's easier for people if you actually explicitly say, well, these things very rarely change, so you can actually track the individual versions. On the other hand, the typical implementation guide where everything changes every time, a little bit, it's just easier to have everything consistently the same version for the implementers. So there's no right answer with that. Now, you do also see sometimes out there unversioned references, unversioned content. So it's got a URL, but it's got no stated version. In those cases, when the tools are doing package resolution, they do package versioning. So in my tools, I find a reference to a resource and the resource doesn't have a version on it. So I say, well, which package did this come from? What's the version on the package reference? What resources did I get from this package and from that package reference? And then I go through them first, and then I fall back to general resolution. So it's called package versioning, and there are some packages out there in your routine use that don't version the individual resources, and the tools have to do package versioning. I encourage you not to depend on that. It's easy for the authors. It's wonderfully easy for the authors. It's not pleasant for the consumers, right? For me, it's hard work because I have to do all the tool tracking, but I can. But if you're a consumer who's just like an author, it's really hard. So I encourage you to version everything. Now, one thing that you'll note is an exception is the URL and extension is not versioned. And we will never version those. They are deliberately not versioned. So when you see a reference to an extension, you can look up the latest definition of the extension, and that'll be safe. And that imposes some rules on how all of us maintain our extension definitions. You simply can't make breaking changes to extension definitions. You want to do that? Well, you can, but you have to be firmly in control of your implementation base. Like you say to everybody, we're going to change it. You're going to deal with the fact that we changed it. You're all good with that. And they all go, yes. And then you discover that actually what you thought was your implementation scope is not, because resources they like to be free. So I encourage you not to do that, but you can do that. All right. We have defined a whole bunch of cross-version extensions. So they follow this pattern. So it'll be hl7.org/fire/5.0/structure definition/extension- and the path. And that is, you would use that if you were saying, I want to use this field out of release 5 in a release 4 resource. We do this for new elements, new types on choice elements and new resource types. And here's a rather extreme example that hopefully it will come up. No, it didn't. Yes, here's a rather extreme example out of my tooling, which Sorry? Okay. Here's an example of my tooling, which is an extreme example, because I can in tooling do these things without thinking about them. Nobody should ever look at this, although Gino showed it off yesterday. But this is an example of the use of cross-version extensions, but they're also extremely controversial. We haven't been able to resolve in committee the correct way to handle differences in available data types, differences in narrative constraints, differences in terminology bindings. In the case where we already have an extension and we migrated it to an element in release 5 or release 6, what happens there? All controversial, and there's ongoing discussion on Julep yesterday. I haven't seen anything today. So those still working on those things. We also version our software tooling. You do you for versioning software tooling. I have nothing to say about that, but our internal tooling is all pretty mature. And I don't really have any product plans around that except for internationalization this year, which Lloyd is going to talk about a bit this afternoon. And I have a BOF, but the BOF is for IG authors. That's soon. But we effectively just do a stream of regular releases, and really the major version is totally arbitrary. All right. You can support multiple versions. I'm going to talk a little bit about API strategy and then a little bit about IG publisher support. So, but first of all, the specification contains considerable information about differences between release 3, release 4, release 5. I'm pointing out that these pages exist because it's a pretty common exchange for me on Zulip. Someone comes and says, hey, nobody describes the differences between the standards. Me, have you looked at this page? Oh, yeah. So these pages exist. Both as text difference with a JSON and XML support, and also an actual transform in file mapping language from release 3 to release 4, and release 4 to release 5. Those transforms are not always successful because sometimes the committees have just gone, no, we're going to change the way we do this resource. And we look at it and go, oh, we don't know how to do the transform. You'll have to figure it out on your own data. There's also in the Java library, considerable conversions between all the versions for particularly the conformance resources. We maintain those with vigor, but you can contribute on other resources, and people do. And they convert between the different versions. Now you can do version independent logic in your implementation, some kind of interface-based thing where you have an interface for all versions of patient, and then you have implementations of patient resources that map onto the interface. You're handwriting this code because you're hand deciding how you're going to handle the differences between versions. Some of the reference implementations do this to some degree. But just converting resources is not enough. Here in a request, in a GET request, for instance, the things highlighted in red are all version specific. So it's not just the resources, it's the whole exchange that are version specific. So the simplest approach for handling this as an implementation, a server, is to put up multiple endpoints. And so there's multiple endpoints on test.file.org, which I will get going again soon. And then you just, each got their own capability statement, which returns the file version, and the client connects to the one that it wants. Well, tx.file.org works the same way. Or you can have a single endpoint that supports multiple versions, and then use the file version parameter on the MIME type to specify which version you actually want as a client. The server looks at that and says, I can do that, I will do that for you. The advantage of this is it's all the one endpoint, and that has multiple advantages in multiple ways. And I'm planning on, for instance, moving tx.file.org to this approach, because otherwise you have to know secretly which the endpoints are. And then the server can tell you which versions it supports and which version it will use if you don't ask it to use a particular version. And here's an example of the exchange. Get a list of versions, and the server will return the list of versions it supports and its default version. Not many servers support that, but I think that we'll start seeing that used more as we get into the R4, R5, R6 world. It wasn't so relevant because R3 to R4 was such a big jump. But now that we've got a stable REST API, I think we'll start seeing more of this. You can also ask a server to convert versions, but to my knowledge, only Happy and my server do this. So Onto server does this, good. Onto server does, probably using the same logic underneath. All right. For non-API exchange, there's always some kind of MIME, almost always some kind of MIME type. But if you really, really want, you can use meta.profile. Although I advise you to just know what version something is, what version something is. All right. I'm not going to talk about persisting. I do very briefly want to talk about IG publisher support. As people chip away at trying to publish implementation guides that describe how to deal with multiple versions, I'm gradually adding more support in the IG publication framework for multiple versions. So at the moment, you can ask the implementation guide publisher to produce output in multiple versions. So terminology.hl7.org is a good case. If you're using release 4, you can say hl7.terminology.terminology.r4, and you'll get all the definitions in R4 format. And mostly the definitions in those packages where we do that, they're not version dependent anyway. Code systems, value sets, the content of those is not version specific in terminology.hl7.org. But you can also ask for some profiles to be produced that are cross-version, and the backport for subscriptions does this. There's a release 4 and a release 5 packages. They have different profiles in them, but there's a real limit to how much you can do with that, and we're still chipping away at that. And also, you'll start seeing implementation guides using some of the new conformance features in release 5, around actor definitions and requirements and obligations that are basically using release 5 resources, but they're aimed at the user, the reader of the documentation. That when it comes to actual implementation on the wire, those bits fall out because you're doing release 4 and you don't have those resources available. As I said before, there's no plans for fully cross-version IGs, and that would break the backbone of my whole framework. So we're chipping away at cross-version support inside implementation guides, but at the moment it's still really one version as an output. All right. Versions are expensive and painful. There's some fantasy land where they don't happen, and there's some fantasy land where you don't have to worry about them. There's also some fantasy land where you can get everybody to agree with you about how versions work. And I've never seen that outside of a very small, tightly managed team. But also, I have seen a lot of clients in particular just making assumptions about versions that are fragile. You should always check the capability statement. You should always check the version and make sure that you don't get caught. And for instance, there's the US core, which is the most well-developed implementation space. There's still actually no way, no stated way for a client to find out which version of US core a server is implementing. We're working on those things, but there's still a lot of cases where people are taking versioning for granted. I took some versioning stuff for granted inside the terminology server that runs tx.fire.org, and I've been paying for that ever since. So invest in getting your versioning right up front, paying attention to it. Thank you. And now it's time for questions. I don't know how long we actually have, given we started late. Oh, good. Okay. Plenty of time for questions then. Who's got a question? Oh, Vadim, you go first.
What is your advice around adopting R5?
I have an R5 talk tomorrow where I'll provide formal advice about that. But very quickly, in one sentence, R5, you should be looking at adopting R5 if you need the features in R5. If you don't need the stuff in R5, then don't change. But I'll say more about it tomorrow.
Hello, Graham.
Hey, Mark.
Thank you for your conversation on versioning. Thank you for referencing testing. I think that a lot of the conversations that we're having today, some of what we're looking at in the future is the results that we capture coming out of testing. We have to test some of these. With what you said, even towards the end there, we're putting a lot of responsibility on the client implementations. We don't see a lot of client implementations testing to that level. We see a lot of servers referencing their capability statement, but we don't see a lot of read operations against metadata. If these clients aren't introspecting the metadata, they're not going to follow some of this. When we look at the guidance at both the implementation guide level and the standards level, we would ask that maybe there be a little more context to the client on what their responsibilities are, but we definitely have to start testing these client implementations around version awareness. We don't see that right now. Your thought on how do we get the community to do more testing?
So thanks for saying I talked about testing, because I don't think I did. I think that it's easier to test the servers because the servers put up a capability that can be used by multiple parties. And so it's inherently more relevant to the developers of the servers to test them. But like I said, in the context of US Core, a server does not declare which version of US Core it's supporting. So that really makes life difficult for the clients. And so all of you who maintain implementation guides, you need to be explicit. How does the client find out? Like in the capability statement, US Core specifies, it does not specify version profiles. Right? It just specifies unversion profiles. So the client can't find out. Are you doing release 4, release 5, release 6 of US Core? So if you are if you're writing implementation guides that servers conform to, please think about that. How would a client find out? Now, there's multiple possible answers. I don't want to tell you what the answer is, but the client does actually need to be able to find out somehow. So first point, and you should test for that. Once you actually have an answer, test that the servers conform to that. With regard to clients, it's harder for clients because clients are often written with less budget, less of an idea that they will be connecting and running against multiple servers. It's harder to test that. And often the business arrangements around clients mitigate against that as well. And my experience is that there's not a lot of point mandating testing that isn't justified by the business context. On the other hand, it's way too easy when you're running a client to assume that what you see is what you get and what you will always get, and not worry about checking versions. Because, hey, why would I need to worry about checking versions? The server will never change. That's not a good assumption, right? And so if you are running clients, I counsel you to actually check and be careful about this, and not just to take for granted that everything is as it is today, because things will change. But really, for me, it's very much a business context thing as to how much testing you should do on the servers, on clients. And I won't say anything more than that about testing.
There's one final update on that, and that is that the use cases today are mostly read operation, very little CRUD going on. But I would offer to you, when you think about that, is when we get into care coordination, bidirectional, when we start getting into test orchestration or use cases that are going to cross multi-actor, multi-organization, you're going to see Fire servers become Fire clients. And there's going to be participation on both sides of that equation. So there's more complexity coming as these business cases, as you defined, as you said, get to care coordination and handshaking, moving data back and forth.
Yes. Maybe, Mario, you should consider getting into the testing business.
Hi, Graham. Right now, the HL7 publisher uses R5 internally. Are we going to change it to start using R6 internally as the R6 resources begin diverging from R5?
So first of all, yes, for all the rest of you, the IG publisher and the validator internally in the internal logic all use R5 for everything. And it confuses implementers a lot because they see the stack dumps as R5 and like, but I'm not doing R5. but internally everything is R5. It's just everything is converted to R5 as it's loaded. But it actually is like although the resources are R5, the model it's using is whatever model you set for the content that it validates against. I did that a long time ago, and that means that it's the only way that the validator can validate all the versions since R2, and the IG publisher can do the same. So now answer your question, Lloyd. James and I have started talking about that. Our inclination at the moment is to stick with R5. And I had to go to R5 early because of changes to breaking resources that I depended on. So I went to R5, but we paid a lot of price for going to R5 really early. Our current inclination is to stick with R5 since the stuff we need is all now normative and stable, except for concept map, which I will continue to bang my head on the wall about. That's not such a problem actually for me because I don't routinely run into lots of them. But I run into lots of concept maps. So our inclination at the moment is we're sticking with R5 until R6 is finalized, but it is not by any means a commitment.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk, Grahame. The question is, say slash metadata API, if it returns a capability statement, if the server is complying to STU3, R4, and R5, which version of the capability statement should it return? I mean, I know, should it also be versioned in the Fire version in the context, or how does that work?
So the server has a default version and all the other versions it supports. If it doesn't get asked, if it gets asked for a capability statement with those specified version, it will return its default version. If it gets asked for a specific version, it will return that version if it can. Otherwise, it returns an error.
Okay, thanks.
Well, let's do one more. Vadim?
Can you go a bit more into the pros and cons of using a single endpoint to manage multiple versions or using multiple and separate endpoints?
For me, the biggest advantage of using a single endpoint is you've got a known endpoint and your references to the resources, the references also version independent. You refer, let's stick with tx.fire.org. It's running R2, R3, R4, and it'll soon be running an R5 endpoint. And so if you want to refer to the endpoint, to a resource on the endpoint, you refer to it by its version. So R3/value_set/X. But so now you have a version specific reference. And maybe on tx.fire.org where you're kind of down in the spec level anyway, that's appropriate. But if you imagine the same thing on a acme.org/patient/123, but actually it's acme.org/patient R3/patient/123 and acme.org/R4/patient/123, the same patient or not? That versioning your references has a it's a long tail of consequences. You'll be pulling that string for a long time. So it's really nice to have one endpoint and then just say, well, whichever version you want, but it's always acme.org/patient/123. Really believe in that. On the other hand, that's kind of a fail if it turns out that the resource was renamed between versions. And let's stick with, because everybody loves this, medication statement was going to be renamed to medication usage, blow all your URLs. So much for the one endpoint. That's not such a good idea. So we're paying much more attention to renaming resources because of that. So I think primarily it's about versioning references. It's much better not to have versioned references if you can avoid it. And so for that reason, I'm intending to go to lead by example and go to a single endpoint. The other problem with tx.fire.org is all of the community is trained when they're using the validator or the publisher to nominate tx.fire.org as the endpoint, but it's not actually the endpoint. A code that I wrote manually that actually says, oh, you nominated tx.fire.org, you didn't mean that. Right, it's secret to my business, but that's not good. That's not good. And so, like say you want to use OntoServer instead. How does that work for OntoServer? The answer is Onto 7 at the moment and does R4, but that'll change soon, right? And so kind of it's not very good for, am I going to write code for every single server in the world? No, that's no good. So that's another reason why a single endpoint's a lot easier for people to manage.
Great. I think that's all the time we have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Graham?
everyone.